Good morning. I'm Jenny Ray LaRue. I'm here this morning with my colleague Naman Mian. We are the hosts of Market Outsiders, and we welcome you today. We're really excited to dive in. Today is Monday, June 16th, and the business news is everywhere if you're just willing to look for it. So I'm looking forward to diving in today. Naman, how was your weekend?
It was great. It was Father's Day weekend, which meant it was a lot of family time. I spent yesterday caulking my bathroom, and I felt like that was like unironically the most Father's Day thing I could have done. But I enjoyed it. It was nice to get away from the screen for a couple days.
I love it. You said that you were staying home, but you didn't say that you were caulking over the weekend. But there you go.
I didn't want to commit to it on Friday until just in case it wasn't going to happen. But now that it's happened, I can proudly say it's done.
That's amazing. Well, our weekend was a little disrupted. I think some of you who've been following the pod for a little bit know that my family and a group of investors bought a hydroelectric power plant earlier this year, and the plant was down for a couple of weeks for reasons that we didn't know because it's our first year owning a hydroelectric power plant. And we had somebody who just kind of spontaneously was able to come up who'd worked on the plant for many years over the weekend. And so my husband was supposed to come down to Southern California where the kids and I are for the weekend. But instead, on Father's Day, we just sent him pictures of all the fun things we were doing without him. I don't know if that's the meanest Father's Day or the nicest Father's Day I've ever had. But we did all the things we would have done with him without him instead. So we went to church and they had donuts at church. Then we went to lunch. Then we went to the beach. Then we went to ice cream. Um, and so we missed having him around, but it was really fun to celebrate dads yesterday.
He, I'm sure he missed you guys, but he might have enjoyed a little bit of a quieter day.
Like he wouldn't have said it, but he probably had a glass of wine. I'm sure he was up at the ranch yesterday, so I'm 100% sure there was fishing happening. And so, it's been fun to watch our years evolve and to think about what a good Father's Day means. I think at the beginning there was a lot of show and then many other things have kind of evolved over time. So yeah, I'm sure we'll still get a chance to celebrate him. But what he did miss out on were tears, a few punches thrown. And so I got that. Woohoo for me.
That's the fun stuff right there.
Yeah. Well, I really wanted to highlight today, there's so much going on in the news every day. But Naman, you and I did a podcast on Strategy Simplified a couple of months ago that was based on our kind of like I would say that we're unabashed fans of Brian Niccol, who's the former CEO of Chipotle, who's now over at Starbucks. And we talked a lot about the key issues and opportunities and the things that we're thinking through when we were talking about the turnaround of Starbucks. And this past weekend was, I think, a really interesting moment in that turnaround. So I thought it might be worth it because we've never really talked about Starbucks on this pod to tie together our long form content. We looked at the details about their operating metrics and and kind of their focus on the future inside the business. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here to talk about something interesting at Starbucks. So I'm going to share my screen and focus on one of the articles that I was reading this morning. I think you all are going to find this really valuable. So one of the things that I think is really fun, and one of the reasons that I knew that I would be interested in consulting is that soon after doing a case for a friend of mine who was at McKinsey, as I was practicing for my McKinsey and my Bain interviews, it was a case on burgers acquiring a donut joint. And so almost maybe 2 to 3 days after that, I went to, I don't think it was McDonald's, but it was a burger joint. And it was like the lens was changed, right? No longer was I there as a customer, but I was thinking about their throughput. I was thinking about the price per basket. I was thinking about the margin. I was thinking about employee count. And so Starbucks is kind of one of those businesses that if you really want to understand business acumen and how businesses operate, you have to get what Starbucks does, not as a customer, but rather as a business operator. And so basically, I don't know if you read this article, so I'll give you a quick high level, right? I'm Starbucks CEO, spent time with about 14,000 store managers at the company's leadership experience in Las Vegas. The store managers were a big focus of that weekend. In fact, he talked a lot about how he wants to win over the employees of Starbucks. There are two main reasons for that. Both, number one, the stated reason, which is that they want to improve the customer experience at Starbucks, and investing in people is the number one way to improve customer experience. In fact, that's one thing that we haven't talked about a lot when we talk about the changes happening at Southwest, about how there may be a focus on profitability, but what could be lost in that process is a focus on the customer experience. But winning over employees is the second thing, and there's kind of a little bit of an asterisk here. There's been a recent union push at Starbucks, and originally Starbucks was lauded for its healthcare benefits, its full-time benefits for baristas, even at the entry level. And that kind of benefit value was in part strategic for longevity, but it was also, again, to avoid a union push amongst Starbucks employees. So there's kind of the stated reason and there's the unstated reason. So with that, before I dive into the rest of the article, Naman, did you hear about this weekend? Do you know anything about it? How long have you followed Starbucks? Tell us a little bit about your overview of what's been going on at Starbucks over the past 6 to 7 months.
Yeah. So I've been following Starbucks fairly closely for the last 5 years. I had no idea that this existed, this leadership experience weekend. I had no idea it was this weekend. So I think it was an interesting choice to hold it over Father's Day weekend, actually. Maybe that was intentional, maybe that wasn't. So I'm excited to learn more. But what I will say is you have had Starbucks that has been on a rapid expansion pace over the last 5 years. They've been opening thousands of locations, not just across the US, but internationally. China had become their second biggest market after the US, and they were facing cutthroat competition there from multiple local players. And, you know, with that expansion came an erosion of profitability and an erosion of same store sales growth. And that led to this leadership change. You had, the feeling beyond just the numbers, you had the feeling that Starbucks had lost its way. You walked into a Starbucks and, you know, it wasn't necessarily a nice place to sit and have a coffee for an hour, but it also wasn't the place where you wanted to come in and grab a coffee in 2 minutes and leave. Like it was somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. It's not a coffee house. I can't sit here and talk with a friend. And it's also not a 2 minute grab and go because I got to stand here for 10 minutes and watch them make 17 complicated orders before they get to my drip coffee. And so I think Brian Niccol was brought in with the mandate of streamlining operations, which would again clarify the value proposition of the brand and start to clarify in the mind of the consumer, okay, what is Starbucks again? Why do you come here? And I think his premise has been if we can do that, then we're going to start to see an uptick in the financial metrics that we care about. So that's top line revenue growth, that's same store sales growth, that is obviously margins. And then I think what plays into that is retention. That's a big part of what we're seeing here today. And he's also slowed the opening of new locations. I think he started to realize that maybe that Starbucks was a little bit oversaturated in its core markets, and it was time to double down on existing stores versus grow primarily through expansion. So that's my high level recap of what I've learned about Starbucks over the last 5 years, and I'm excited to dive into kind of what's been happening this weekend.
Well, on that point, Naman, there is actually some really good insight in this article. So I kind of want to just go through and talk about a few of the things that caught my eye. A lot of what we talk about here is what you would find in a 5 minute glance that would lead you into the next level. And so one of the things that we're kind of focused on here, number one, this was a 3 day event last week for more than 14,000 store leaders. So the news broke on Sunday, but a lot of the main focus was over a pretty long event. 14,000 store leaders is pretty significant. They talk about this theme of what they're calling back to Starbucks. One of the things that I found really interesting from my experience in politics is that I often wanted to share what the future would look like. I think this is a really strategic choice by Niccol because the idea of hearkening back to something in California, the golden age was often the thought of as the 1980s. And so if you say like we want to bring California back to where it was before, it's really easy for people to interpret that. If you say we want to take it forward to something new, they can't envision what that feels like. So nostalgia is powerful as a brand cohesion and as a message. So that's just a really interesting piece. And he's talked about that for a number of years. Um, the company laid off around 1,100 corporate workers earlier in the year, saying it aimed to operate more efficiently and reduce redundancies. So, part of what's happening here is that they're both laying off and hiring at the same time. I think it's really important to note where those staffing changes are happening. But that 1,100 workers, it doesn't say here what percentage of their overall basis that is, or what kind of total savings there were potentially. But that's a normal thing. If you focus on expansion, you just add and add and add, and you often don't pay attention to lean redundancies that could happen. Um, they talk a little bit about the share price, which I don't put as much stock in as the operating metrics. So it's saying that it was, trading close to where it was when Niccol was announced as CEO, but it has never surpassed that in the last year, which I think is interesting. We haven't seen some of the changes that they've been looking at. But this is, one of the few things, right? I actually can't believe that they didn't do this already. Before launching new drinks, the company is first testing them in 5 stores to gain feedback from baristas. So apparently Starbucks just was like, hey, we tested this not in the wild, and we're going to throw it out to everyone all at the same time. That to me is kind of an astonishing gap in their operating processes. So they talked about fixing that. I've never seen a store like I've worked in death services. I've worked in restaurants. I've worked in like, Orlando theme parks. Like I've never seen a place where something hasn't been tested in the wild before being rolled out, especially someone with the scale of Starbucks. And then the last thing that I just want to highlight here, and then I'd love to get your feedback on a couple of these things, is that the next year most North American stores will add an assistant manager to their rosters. So historically, they have not been operating as a classic. So it's been kind of manager of the store who's there and in charge 24/7. And then there's been the baristas at the store. So they're adding kind of a middle management layer in each one of the stores. Um, so those are kind of a couple of the big things. There's a few more metrics down below. Would love to get your initial feedback on some of those, and then we can talk about the last of the metrics before we move on.
Yeah, I'll just key in on the assistant manager news. I think it makes a lot of sense to me. If you've identified that you've got operational inefficiencies as kind of the linchpin of your lack of success, then I think where you need to add staffing is on the ground level. And so I think what you're seeing is a shift away from overstaffing at the corporate level, and then some of that capital being redeployed back into the store level. And that sounds like the right answer if you've kind of determined that you're declining customer traffic, you're declining sales growth, all of that are tied back to some of these efficiency metrics. So I think it makes a lot of sense to add that assistant manager position. And then what you mentioned, January, at the very beginning is top of mind for me as well. I think if you're going to make store managers feel like they're more supported, what you are really doing is you're trying to deflate the union push that's happening at the store level as well. So not only is it good business from like an efficiency perspective and an operational metric perspective, I think this is also a shot across the bow at some of the union organizers saying, look, hey, we're listening and you can deal directly with us without having to unionize. And we'll see if it works.
Agreed. I think one thing that's super interesting is that, if you think about the operating hours of a Starbucks, if having one manager for 7 days a week, 12 plus hour days, that's pretty extraordinary, actually.
My
Um,
Yeah, I
right?
was just going to say, my guess is they probably had baristas who had been identified as shift leaders. And so you had them playing the role of assistant manager, but probably not being compensated as an assistant manager. So you probably had, you
Or
know,
without the authority or the
or the
buy-in or the upward mobility,
exactly.
right? Yeah,
So then you end up
exactly.
with disgruntled store managers and disgruntled baristas, and that's a lose-lose.
So one of the other things that I think is really interesting, I just wanted to highlight this. I often find the most interesting piece of the business news is not in the first half of an article. That was absolutely true for me here. So one of the things that they talked about was that removing seats from locations and kind of the operational changes. They talked about actually hearing that feedback from the store managers, and Niccol is from Newport Beach, really close to where I am right now. And he said his local Starbucks manager actually grabbed his ear and said, "Hey, this is what I want to do. Don't take my seats out of my store because I don't want a renovated store because I want the old way. I think I can do better with that." But also, I think like this is it for me, right? Although historically, roughly 60% of Starbucks store managers have been internal promotions, I was like, where did the other 40% come from? Right? Like when you see a number like that, like where did the other 40% of people who are store managers come from? Did they come from like McDonald's? I mean, talk about a cultural erosion. You have thousands and thousands of baristas nationwide. Like that creates that rift that leads to a union push when you have the store managers being brought in from the outside and all of the baristas on the ground. So the company wants to raise that to 90%. They also are planning to add 10,000 more locations. You talked about really doubling down on same store sales, which has been true, but this is the first time that I've seen the news that they're also planning to add 10,000 more locations in the US, which
I
is a
think
really significant footprint
it
expansion.
is. I think the key word there is eventually, because that had been in the plans already for a while. And I think one of the first things that Niccol did when he came on board is pump the brakes on those. So I think what this tells me is that he's starting to feel confident that like he might have an internal dashboard he's looking at that's starting to show him like that early returns are promising on some of the changes that he's making. And so I think you start to like release this trial balloon when you feel like the operational changes you're making are working. I think this is more of a signal to investors than a signal to anybody else.
Agreed. But one of the things that that they did talk about this weekend specifically was how many more new leadership positions
Mhm.
this added to. So from a career mobility standpoint, I know we're going to kind of pivot in just a second to talk a little bit about unemployment and unemployment rates. But I thought this was very interesting because one of the things that Starbucks is trying to do is not just internally promote to store manager, but actually create a long-term career pathway for some of its baristas. And I've never thought of Starbucks as the place to do that. But interestingly, we've never profiled Waffle House, but I think of a store like Waffle House that pretty famously has a very long tenure and very high salaries for a lot of their in-store managers. I think of a place like Buc-ee's, which we have profiled, which has pretty extraordinary numbers where you're in charge of your own multi-million dollar business at the ground level. Like this principle of the store manager being an on-the-ground business operator, RBI, which runs Burger King and other brands, actually had a program at Columbia Business School where your job when you graduated was to be a district manager for one of these kind of organizations. And I just think like those kinds of operational roles are really, really undervalued in a lot of organizations. I think he's placing the right stoplight on those. So anyhow, just wanted to get your final feedback on Starbucks. And then if there's anything else that you wanted to share today, I would love to hear about it.
So I think from a business perspective, this is a really fascinating story. From an investing perspective, it just kind of amuses me that Niccol was more successful before he ever started. Like, if your goal as a CEO is to like maximize shareholder returns, then the stock popped 25% the day his hiring was announced, and it's never reached that level again. And so I'm sure from an operational perspective, he's doing a lot of good, but from a shareholder perspective, like he's already accomplished what he was brought in to accomplish, which was kind of bringing the stock back to where it was supposed to be. It's dipped since that high. And so, all of this just depends on your perspective. Like, how do you view Starbucks? Are you an investor? Are you a customer? Are you a student of business? And then are you personally invested in Starbucks? And I think those biases color the way that you see the business. I'm not an investor in Starbucks, and so I'm fascinated by the business story. But if I had been a long-term investor in Starbucks, I would have been thrilled at the beginning and then disappointed since because he hasn't been able to build on the base of that stock price pop. And we'll see if these changes eventually lead to a change in the fundamentals, which eventually lead to a change in the share price. But again, interesting to note the difference between how the market sees things and how quickly the market moves on pricing some of these things in versus what's happening in the actual business.
I would absolutely agree. In fact, I think when you look at this, a lot of this is still very future looking, and we're almost 8 months in. And so Niccol has so far made a significant number of changes, but I don't think that Starbucks is seeing the operating metrics according to those changes yet. It seems like a lot of this focus right now is largely internally communications and political, right? He's trying to keep a seat on the board. Even if you go down even a little bit further, you read about who was paraded across the stage, some of the kind of fan favorites of the weekend. I think he's still working on building trust inside the organization, and this is going to be maybe a longer turnaround than others that we've seen. I think you and I would still say, like, if we were betting on a horse race, we'd bet on Brian Niccol.
Hmm.
But like you said, I don't think that some of the immediate returns for shareholders have been there. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what some of those changes look like. Anything else that you want to tie this to, Naman, in the broader macroeconomics? I know took a long time to talk about Starbucks today, but I just thought it
I'll,
was an interesting story with a lot to unpack.
yeah. So Starbucks is often a first job for many people, especially college students. And one of the things that I've been tracking recently is youth unemployment. And so we'll dive into the numbers a little bit later this week, but just a preview for folks. Youth unemployment is 2 points higher than the general unemployment rate. And the way that I'm defining youth unemployment here is unemployment for folks ages 21 to 24 years old that have a bachelor's degree. And so, like, that unemployment rate is around 6% nationally. Now, if you extrapolate that out to people who don't have bachelor's degrees, like the unemployment rate's in the double digits. So,
Is
you
that
are
right?
seeing
So it's higher if you don't have a bachelor's degree?
mhm.
That's fascinating to
In
me.
that age
That's
range.
actually not what I would have expected. I would have expected it would have been muted by folks that are either having trade degrees or who went to work immediately. So that to me is actually an even more
It's
fascinating piece of the number.
it is big news, and the if folks are heading to the trades, right? I know there's apprenticeship programs that like prepare you for the trades, and there might be a little bit of a lag effect between kind of the time you graduate from an apprentice program and like actually join the trades full time, and maybe that's what's showing up in the data. But right now, you're seeing higher unemployment for kind of Gen Z college grads, and even higher unemployment for Gen Z kind of high school grads without a college degree. And so, kind of what I've been thinking about over the last few days is we have two different job markets. We have a job market for those of you who already are employed, and then we have a job market for those who are unemployed. And if you're unemployed, it does seem like it's a little bit more difficult right now to get a job. One of the other things that I've been tracking are the weekly, like ongoing jobless claims. So what gets in the headlines a lot are the initial claims that are made every week. And the initial claims are a good proxy for how many people are getting laid off or losing their jobs or leaving their jobs in that week. And that number stayed fairly steady. But what's been slowly rising are the ongoing claims. And so that tells me that, okay, the layoff activity is fairly muted. Like that's not necessarily increasing, but what is increasing is the time that it takes people to find a new job. And that's especially true with entry level workers, but it's actually true across the board. Like you are seeing kind of ongoing jobless claims increase week after week after week. And it's not something I'm necessarily concerned about yet from a macroeconomic perspective, but it is something to pay attention to because I think it's another sign that the labor market's like maybe starting to show a few cracks. And so it obviously feels like a crisis if it's affecting you personally, but from a big picture perspective, it's just something I think for every economic watcher to be paying attention to. It's not just news of layoffs that matters, it's news of how long it's taking people to find new jobs.
So, Nuwan, if I were listening to the pod today, I'd say I'd really love to have a breakdown of the way that unemployment is actually calculated, because one of the things I think our job is to do is to make sure that when you're parroting numbers, you actually understand them. That's our job as well. So, in a future episode, we're going to go through how we actually calculate the unemployment rates inside the US and what some of the niche rates are that we look at, the same way that we look at, for example, treasury yields at different paces than maybe other people do. We also look at different kinds of inflation, not just the inflation rate, but the different kinds of inflation. And so we'll share some more of that with you as we go forward in the future. But I think a big part of getting to where you need to go in terms of business savvy, both as an operator and as an investor, is understanding what's underneath the surface. Thanks again for joining us today. We're excited to be with you. We'll be here at the same time each week. And we're really excited to have you just weigh in if there's businesses, metrics, or questions that you have about something that you hear on the pod. So please send us a message. See you soon.